They tore down my fence while I was at work. Not damaged it, not loosened a few boards. I mean, completely tore it out like it never existed, and somehow acted like they were doing me a favor. So I made a decision right then, standing there in my backyard with nowhere to hide anymore. If they were going to erase my boundary, I was going to redraw it in a way they wouldn't forget. I remember that moment really clearly, because it didn't feel dramatic at first, it just felt wrong. I pulled into my driveway like any other weekday, still thinking about emails I hadn't answered, half listening to a podcast, nothing out of the ordinary. And then I stepped into my backyard, and the first thing I noticed was the light. It was too bright. Not in a poetic way, not like some kind of peaceful sunshine, more like the kind of light that makes you squint because something's off. My yard wasn't supposed to look like that. Then it hit me, the fence was gone. Now this wasn't some cheap little divider you forget about. This was a full 6-foot cedar privacy fence, solid, heavy, the kind that blocks out the world just enough so you can sit outside in peace without feeling like you're on display. It had been there long before I bought the house, probably 15 years at least, and one of the reasons I chose that place was because it felt contained, you know? Like your space was actually yours. And now it was just open. I walked closer, slow at first, like maybe my brain needed time to catch up. And that's when I saw it all stacked neatly on the other side of the property line. Panels leaned up like leftovers from a demolition job. Posts pulled clean out of the ground. Not broken, not rotted, just removed. Carefully. Intentionally. That's when the irritation started creeping in. I didn't even go inside. I just turned and walked straight over to the neighbor's yard, because at that point there was no question where the fence went. Their backyard looked like a full-blown construction site. Deck half ripped apart, stone pavers scattered, tools everywhere, guys in work boots moving like they were on a schedule. And right in the middle of all that chaos was this guy, mid-40s maybe, baseball cap, clipboard in hand, talking like he owned the place which, as I was about to learn, he definitely thought he did. He noticed me standing there and gave this quick nod like we were already on the same page. "Hey," he said, casual, like we were discussing the weather. "We took down that old fence. It was falling apart anyway." And I just stood there for a second, letting that sentence hang, because there's something about people making decisions about your property like it's theirs that hits a very specific nerve. I looked past him at the pile of cedar boards and then back at him. "You mean my fence?" He blinked, just slightly, like that hadn't even crossed his mind. "It was on the line," he said, shrugging. "Kind of a shared thing. Now here's the thing. I'm not the type to explode right away. I don't yell, I don't make a scene, but I do pay attention." And something about the way he said that, so confident, so dismissive, like the details didn't matter, that told me he either didn't know what he was talking about, or he didn't care. "Do you have a survey?" I asked. He paused, just for a second, then waved his hand like I'd asked something irrelevant. "We're putting in a new one anyway," he said, nodding toward the yard. "Horizontal slats, modern style. It'll look a lot better." Better. That word did it. Not because of the fence itself, but because of what it meant. He had already decided what was better for a space that wasn't entirely his, and somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that gave him the right to act. I didn't argue. Not there, not in front of his contractors, not while everything was still loud and messy. I just nodded once, turned around, and walked back to my house. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that reacting in the moment usually costs you more than it gains. But I wasn't letting it go. Inside, I went straight to the drawer where I kept all my closing documents. The stuff you barely look at after signing, but somehow always know exactly where it is when you need it. It took me maybe 2 minutes to find the survey map, and when I laid it out on the table, that quiet irritation turned into something sharper. The fence line wasn't on the boundary. It was inside it, by about 5 inches. Now 5 inches doesn't sound like much, but legally, it's everything. That meant every post, every panel, every single board they pulled out of the ground belonged entirely to me. And suddenly, this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a choice. I remember just standing there for a while, staring at that line on the paper, thinking about how easily this could have gone differently. A knock on the door, a quick conversation, maybe even an agreement to replace it together. None of that happened. Instead, they skipped straight to action, like permission was optional. That's when I decided I wasn't going to argue about it. I was going to prove it. The next morning, I called a surveyor. Not a big dramatic move, just a simple request, Verify the property line. Mark it clearly. Make it undeniable. The guy showed up that afternoon. Older, quiet, the kind of person who doesn't say much because he doesn't have to. He took his measurements, checked his equipment twice, and then started placing bright orange stakes along the edge of the yard. And as each one went into the ground, something shifted. Because now it wasn't just me saying where the line was. It was visible, permanent, real. About halfway through, I noticed my neighbor standing at the edge of his yard, watching, arms crossed, expression tight, like the situation was no longer unfolding the way he expected. He waited until the last stake was set before walking over. "That can't be right," he said. And for the first time since this started, I smiled just a little. "Oh," I said, calm, steady, "it is." And that was the moment everything changed. He stood there for a second after I said that, just staring at the stakes like they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough, like reality was negotiable if you looked confident enough. Then he let out this short laugh, not amused, more like irritated, and shook his head. "Man, that doesn't make any sense," he said, glancing back at his half-demolished deck like the answer might be hiding there. "That fence has been there forever." "Exactly," I said, still calm, still measured, "on my property." That's when his tone shifted, just slightly, but enough to feel it. Not loud, not aggressive, just tighter, like he was starting to realize this wasn't going to be brushed off. "Look," he said, stepping a little closer, lowering his voice like we were having a private conversation now. "We're already in the middle of a full renovation here. The contractor's on a schedule, materials are ordered. We're not putting that old thing back." I nodded slowly, like I understood, because I did. Schedules, budgets, timelines, they matter. But they don't override ownership. "I'm not asking you to put back the old one," I said. "I'm telling you shouldn't have taken it down in the first place." There was a pause then, one of those quiet, heavy pauses where both people know the conversation just crossed a line. Behind him, one of the contractors glanced over, clearly listening, then went back to work like he didn't want to get involved. "Smart guy." My neighbor ran a hand over his face, exhaling through his nose. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "What? You want to stop the whole project over a fence?" And right there, that question told me everything. Because to him, it was just a fence. Replaceable. Cosmetic. Something you upgrade when you want the yard to look nicer. But to me, it was the line. "I'm saying," I replied, "that until this is resolved, you shouldn't be building anything along this side of the property." He blinked again, slower this time. "You don't get to control my renovation." I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I didn't need to say it yet. Instead, I just gave a small nod, like I was filing that statement away for later, and turned back toward my house. "Have a good one," I said over my shoulder. Now, if you've ever dealt with someone who's used to getting their way, you know that calmness, that lack of reaction, it unsettles them more than yelling ever could. Because there's nothing to push against. No argument to win. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not out of anger, not even out of stress, but because my brain kept replaying everything, running through possibilities, outcomes, options. I kept coming back to the same thought. This wasn't just about replacing a fence anymore. It was about precedent. If I let this slide, what happens next time? A few inches becomes a foot becomes a structure, and suddenly your space starts shrinking without you ever agreeing to it. And the thing is, I didn't want to fight, but I also wasn't going to lose ground just because someone else moved faster. The next morning, I made a call. Not to a lawyer, not yet, just to the city building department. And I didn't go in with accusations or complaints. I just asked a question, a very specific one. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral, almost casual. "If someone is expanding a deck near a property line and a boundary structure like a fence gets removed, does that trigger any kind of setback verification requirement?" There was a pause on the other end, some typing, a page flipping maybe. Then the guy came back. "Yeah," he said. "If the boundary reference changes, we usually need to confirm compliance before work continues." That was all I needed. I thanked him, hung up, and went about my day like nothing had happened. No confrontation, no warning, just documentation and process. Because at that point, it wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural. 2 days later, a city inspector showed up. I wasn't even home when he arrived, but I saw it all on my security camera later. White truck pulling up, clipboard, measuring tape, that slow, deliberate walk people in those roles have, like they've seen every version of this situation before. My neighbor came out to meet him, and even from the footage, you could tell he was trying to keep things light, gesturing toward the deck, talking fast, probably explaining how everything was under control. The inspector didn't rush. He walked the line, the actual line, the one marked by those bright orange stakes, and started measuring. From the new deck framing to the boundary. From the boundary to the existing structure. He crouched down at one point, looked at the ground where the old post holes still marked where my fence had been, and just nodded to himself. That little nod, that was the moment. Because it meant he understood. About 20 minutes later, he straightened up, said something short, handed over a paper, and that was it. No raised voices, no drama, just a decision written in black and white. Stop work order. Temporary, pending verification and correction, but enough to bring everything to a halt. By the time I got home that afternoon, the energy next door had completely changed. The tools were quieter, fewer people moving around. That sense of urgency replaced by something heavier, uncertainty. One of the contractors was loading equipment into a truck. Another was sitting on the edge of the half-built deck scrolling through his phone like he was waiting for instructions that weren't coming. And my neighbor, he wasn't smiling anymore. He saw me as I walked into my backyard, and for a second, we just looked at each other across that open space where the fence used to be. No words, just acknowledgement. Then he turned and went inside. I figured that would be the end of it for the day. It wasn't. Around 7 that evening, just as the sun was starting to dip and the lights softened back into something normal again, there was a knock on my door. Not aggressive, not hesitant either, just firm. I opened it, and there he was. No clipboard this time, no contractor energy, just him. And for the first time since this started, he looked tired. "You called them," he said. Not a question. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms, mirroring the posture he'd had when he first saw the survey stakes. "I asked a question," I replied. He let out a breath, shaking his head. "This delay is costing me money," he said, running a hand through his hair, pacing once across my porch like he needed to burn off the frustration. "Every day we're shut down. I'm paying guys to sit around or rescheduling everything." "I believe you," I said. And I did. But then I added, "Replacing a fence you didn't own costs money too." That landed. He stopped pacing, looked out toward the yard again, toward those bright markers that hadn't moved, that weren't going to move. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I could see it. That internal shift, the one where someone realizes they're not negotiating from a position of control anymore. Finally, he turned back to me. "So what do you want?" he asked. And there it was. Not a denial, not an argument, a question. Terms. I took a second before answering, not for effect, just to make sure I said it exactly the way I meant it. "I want my fence rebuilt," I said, steady, clear, on my property line, where it was. Same height, same coverage. He opened his mouth like he was about to push back, then stopped himself. "We were planning something more modern," he said, quieter now, almost like he was negotiating with himself. "You still can," I replied. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you can build whatever you want," I said, gesturing lightly toward his side of the yard. "On your side." There was a pause, longer this time, because now he understood. 2 fences, 2 lines, no confusion. And for the first time since this all started, he didn't argue. He stood there on my porch a little longer after that, like he was doing the math in his head, not just the money, but the pride, the inconvenience, the fact that this whole thing had slipped out of his control in a way he didn't expect. You could almost see the moment it clicked that this wasn't going to be one of those situations where he could just push through and fix it later. 2 fences, he muttered, half to himself. 2 properties, I corrected gently. That landed differently. He looked at me for a second, then nodded once, slow, resigned. "All right," he said. "All right. I hear you. Now I wish I could tell you that was the moment everything wrapped up clean and easy, but real life doesn't work like that. Agreement is one thing, execution is another. And when money, timelines, and ego are all involved, even a simple solution can drag a little." The next couple days were quiet. No construction noise, no trucks, no early morning hammering. Just this strange pause, like the whole situation was holding its breath. I still saw him occasionally, coming and going, always a little more subdued than before, and every time his eyes drifted toward those survey stakes, You could tell he wasn't seeing them anymore as an inconvenience. They were a boundary he had to respect. By the end of the week, a fencing crew showed up. Different company than the one doing his deck, which I appreciated more than I expected. It meant he wasn't trying to fold this into his existing project, wasn't trying to cut corners or rush it. These guys came in focused, professional, measuring twice, marking carefully, setting their line exactly where those bright orange stakes had been sitting all week like silent witnesses. I watched from my kitchen window that first morning, coffee in hand, not hovering, not interfering, just observing. There's something oddly satisfying about seeing something get put back the right way after it's been handled the wrong way. Every post they set, they poured concrete around the base, solid, permanent, not going anywhere. No shortcuts. At one point, one of the workers caught me watching and gave a small nod, like he understood the situation without needing the full story. That's the thing about people who do this kind of work. They've seen enough property line disputes to recognize one from a mile away. By the second day, the structure started to take shape. Fresh cedar panels, same 6-foot height, same closed design. Not an exact replica of the old fence, but close enough that it felt familiar. More importantly, it felt like mine again. Like that invisible line had been restored, not just physically, but mentally. My neighbor stayed out of the way for most of it. Occasionally he'd step outside, check on progress, say a few words to the crew, but he didn't come over, didn't try to revisit the conversation. And honestly, I respected that. There's a point where talking more doesn't fix anything. It just reopens things that are already settled. On the third day, the last panel went up. I stepped outside that evening, walked the length of the fence slowly, running my hand along the wood, feeling the texture, the solidity of it. It's funny how something you barely think about when it's there suddenly feels significant when it's taken away and then returned. And then I noticed something else. About 3 inches on the other side of my fence, another line of posts had been set. His fence. Sleek, horizontal slats, darker wood, exactly the modern style he'd been talking about from the beginning. Clean lines, sharp angles. It looked good, I'll give him that. But it sat entirely on his side, separate, distinct, not touching mine. Back-to-back fences. A gap just wide enough to make the point unmistakable. 2 properties. 2 choices. 2 responsibilities. Construction on his deck resumed the following week. The stop work order had been lifted once everything was verified, and this time, everything stayed within the lines. Measurements were double-checked, adjustments made where needed, no assumptions, no shortcuts. The pace was slower than before, more cautious, like the project had learned something. Or maybe he had. It ended up taking about a month longer than he originally planned. I heard that through one of the contractors one morning when we both happened to be outside at the same time. He didn't complain, just mentioned it in passing, like stating a fact. But you could hear it in his voice, the cost of moving too fast at the beginning. We never really talked about it again. Not in any direct way. We'd cross paths occasionally, a nod here, a brief morning there, the kind of polite distance people settle into when something's been resolved but not forgotten. And that's fine. Not every conflict needs to end in friendship. Sometimes respect is enough. What stayed with me, though, wasn't the fence itself. It was how easy it had been for that line to disappear. Not physically. That part took effort, tools, a crew. But mentally, it only took one assumption. One decision made without checking, without asking, without considering that the space you see isn't always the space you own. And I'll be honest, there was a moment, early on, where I almost let it go. Where I thought, it's just a fence, maybe it's not worth the trouble. Because dealing with conflict, even when you're right, is exhausting. It pulls your time, your energy, your attention into something you never asked for. But then I thought about what comes after that kind of decision. If you don't protect your boundaries the first time they're crossed, you don't get to be surprised when they're crossed again. So yeah, I made a few calls, asked a few questions, let the process do what it's designed to do. No yelling, no threats, no big dramatic showdown, just clarity. And in the end, that was enough. Now when I sit out back in the evenings, there's still sunlight, but it hits differently. It stops where it's supposed to stop. There's a line again, solid and quiet, doing exactly what it's meant to do without needing attention. And every now and then, I catch myself looking at those 2 fences standing side by side, and thinking how strange it is that something so simple can carry so much weight. So here's what I'm curious about. If you were in that situation, would you have done the same thing? Would you have pushed back or just let it slide and kept the peace? Because depending on how you see it, this story is either about standing your ground or making a problem bigger than it needed to be. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear where you land on it. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor situation that got out of hand like this, share that too. Those stories always get interesting. And if you enjoy real-life situations like this, the kind that sit somewhere between right and wrong and make you think a little, go ahead and subscribe. There's more coming. Trust me, people get weird when it comes to property lines.